We are going to die!
Well, we've all been there, haven't we? We all find ourselves in these kind of tight spots where when our resources to cope or to deal with a situation may not be enough, and we feel like that the walls are closing in and the end is imminent. But one thing that we know is that because we're sitting here and together, we did get through that situation, and so that has built resilience, hopefully. And that is exactly what we're going to kind of get to today. We're going to talk about stress, and one of the things that I have to tell you is that I am definitely not an expert in this space, but because I have such a passion to find a improvement on my emotional health, this is some areas that I pursue and hope to be well in. And so one of the things that we'll tell you is, even though you're going to be stressed, don't worry, because if you spell stress backwards, it's dessert. So now we're looking into this module where we're going to find a definition for stress, and we're also going to look at the parameters of stress, meaning like there's this spectrum, and it's a wide spectrum, and there's a good side and maybe not so good of a side. And so we're going to look at that and how we react in that. We're also going to talk about the major sources of stress, and then we're going to sum up this video and look at the stress that's going on in America. In our next video, you're going to find that we're going to spend a little bit more time on the physiological response of stress and what that looks like in our body. We're also going to talk about what happens, the harms that can happen to our body, but also to very specific systems. And then we're going to spend some time looking at management of stress and some strategies on how to do that. And then we're going to end that second video talking about anxiety and how it's kind of a loop that occurs after stress has been in our lives for a long time. So as we kind of begin, let's look at one of the module quotes here. And I love this quote because it is so very true, especially in my life, to remember that stress doesn't come from what's going on in your life. It comes from your thoughts about what's going on in your life. And that is really a key thing. So let's just kind of understand the definition of stress. And as we do, let's look for a keyword here. But stress is defined as a condition of feeling experienced when a person, and here's the keyword, perceives that demands exceed the personal or social resources that an individual is able to mobilize. So this is your perception. This wall is closing around on you, and it is surely going to kill you. But what we know is that many times our expectations aren't met, at least not in that negative sense. And so what we have to understand that there's many stressors that we're going to face in our life, and a stressor is simply anything where the body tries to adapt. Now I love this definition too because it helps to paint the picture of the physiology that stress is. And that's really what we hope to leave you with today, is that you understand stress is physiology. It's what we do with that matters. And so when we look at this next aspect of stress, it helps us to paint a picture of maybe hope and relief. But what we know is this is not a disease state. No, not stress in itself. Stress is just the physiology. The disease state can persist, and we'll talk about that in the next video. But what we know is that this is a state of your brain where there are some physical changes that could occur. And because of those changes, those physical changes in your brain, what we know is they're called neural pathways. I think about it like this. I have several dogs, and they travel between my house and my neighbor's house, which happens to be my brother. But when they travel, they always travel the same path, and they've worn a really solid trail, and you can see it, and they always take this path. Well, the only way I could ever get rid of that trail is to get rid of the dogs. And so I don't want to do that right now because I'm a very passionate dog lover. But what I know is that if the dogs ever go away, that trail will grow up. And honestly, this is what we're doing with our chronic thoughts. You see, we're taking one thought and we're allowing it to build a trail, a pathway. For some of it's the major highway in our brain, and it changes the chemistry of our brain as well. And so this distorted thought that is continually happening in our brain, it takes over. And so if this is only a one-time event, we're going to call it acute. It's very temporary. It happens and then it goes away. But for many of us, and I think that it's definitely true for me, this becomes chronic, meaning like it is persistent. It happens over a long period of time. And that's where the detrimental effects of stress really set in. And so when you hear about stress being bad, this is bad because you can't live this way. It's going to change physiological functions. And so as we look at that, we're going to remember it's a perceived threat. It's anything that the body tries to adapt to. And it does cause brain changes. But there is hope, and I want to continue to impress you with that. Now, there's two versions of stress that we must identify. First of all, let's talk about where stress is good in our life. And this is kind of like the situation where things definitely get your physiology going, but it's for a benefit. So we know that there is a euphoric stress, and that's where the word eustress comes from, is it's good. And with this good stress, what we know is that it actually has a positive response where it assists us and it motivates us and it helps us to grow. For instance, when I think about going to college and how much stress that was in, and it could have been financial, or it could have been the fact that I thought I was intellectually inept. Well, either way, there was stress, and that helped to motivate me to want to be better, to want to do better, to want to grow, right? So that is a eustress, and it definitely is a thing that many of you experience. Some of you would say, no, that's just not how I feel, and hopefully we can paint a different picture for you soon. But we also know that stress helps us to take risk. You know, there's many people out there who will invest in stocks and they play the market and hope for good things to happen for their financial health. And many times that can happen, but many times the opposite can happen. But if you don't ever have some stress about it, you won't take risk. You'll stay at home, you'll stay in bed, you'll never get out, and that's not a place to live. And then the third thing we want to look at is how stress helps us to perform at high levels. If you sought out any high-level functioning athlete, especially Olympians, but if they're at the top of their athletic field, they will tell you that they use their stress wisely. And some of the best really know how to capture this. It's only when you can take stress and capture it and use it as your friend can you truly find courage. And you're going to see that in our supplemental video. And I hope that that's a real game changer for you. But some other examples that I want to share for you is, first of all, eustress for me is exercise. Every time I go out the door, I kind of wonder, am I going to be able to do this? And even though I've done it thousands and thousands of times, it's still a question in my mind, especially at certain environments. And so that doesn't change, but it definitely helps to drive me to want to do it. Another thing is I really enjoy fasting. It's a tough thing to do, and I'm always anxious on whether or not I can do it. But I always know that when I finish and I break my fast, if it's only 24 hours even, it's so rewarding because it has helped me, and I will be completely honest, I use fasting as a spiritual practice, but what I also know is there are some physiological things that are going on that help me grow as a person. Another one is, again, investing, or maybe it's even for you taking a quiz. You kind of get a little excited about a quiz. I know if you've ever sat down to do a Kahoot in your classroom, you get excited and you kind of get a little competitive, but it's a good thing and it's eustressful. Another thing is if you go out on a date, you're kind of curious as to whether or not this is going to go well and what happens if it doesn't. Well, let me just tell you, you're experiencing eustress because hopefully it is a good thing. But then also, what happens on the other side of this when you're screwing up a lot in life and you need somebody to kind of hold you accountable? Well, I will tell you that when your friend who loves you deeply comes to you and says, this is not a good direction for you and you're not doing it right, it hurts at first and it's stressful at first, but you know the growth is going to come from that. That's a eustressful event, right? And so if you swing the pendulum all the way to the other end, you're going to find something called distress. And this is what we all think about with stress. But what we know is distress is kind of that negative response that comes from that perceived situation. And it often does have negative outcomes, and it does often diminish our wellness. But we also know that if you build on this, if it's frequent and it's prolonged and it lasts and lasts and lasts, it's going to be a constant and chronic overdrive on your stress system, and there's going to be some problems persist out of that. And we're going to see that later, but what we know is it does happen to most of us. Now, the important thing is how do you deal with that, right? So you can, again, look at this as a one-time temporary event, or you can kind of see this flow throughout a person's lifetime and persist. And so it's desperately needed for us to say, okay, this is too much and I know I need to face this stress. So why is that a problem? Well, let's just kind of talk about some of the more psychological versions of this. And number one is your coping mechanism starts to fail. And what is that? That's your ability to say, okay, I can deal with this. And if it continues, you may start to doubt that and say, I don't think I can deal with this. And this actually takes us and fast forwards us to the next thing here, which is your hope starts to diminish. And what do you do when you don't have hope? Like, where's the end then? I mean, like, how do you ever get past it? And so you've got to see that if your resilience fails, your hope's going to fail, and then you're going to lose all sense of control. And this is where things go south, because now you're not in control, and sometimes someone else has to come in and be in control for you. And that's really not a place where we want you to be. So one other aspect, though, is we often see that these people, they just don't build resilience. And one of the things that I know, and we're going to talk about later, is how you have some situations in your life, some scenarios or some past experiences where maybe you saw some resilience built because you got through it. And we're going to ask you to talk about that in your assignment for this module. One of the things that I know, though, and I will talk to you very openly about, is when I lost my mother. I was 19, and that was very difficult because I was young, but also she was very young. She was only 50. And for some of you, you're like, no, that's not very young. But listen, for some of you, that's 30 years from now. And if you're ready to check in 30 years, that's a really doubtful situation. And so I'm going to say I doubt that that's true. But you think about it from that perspective, and you're like, okay, that is young. That built resilience in me. It wasn't a fun process. In fact, it tore me to pieces. But it did help launch me in some better directions. And I did find some good in that. And I'm certainly not happy it happened. I'm certainly not happy it happened. But I am certainly happy that I was able to find good in that situation. Now, what happens when all this doesn't work? Well, you're going to have to look into three things. Number one, you're going to have to look into possibly counseling. That's a professional person pouring into you, feeding into you, helping you through the situation. Number two, you may need some chemical help. And I don't mean chemical as far as illicit drugs, but I do certainly mean chemicals that are pharmaceutical in nature and prescribed by a physician, especially one who knows about mental health. Because what I know, and many people will probably question even my faith at this statement, but I will tell you that because of our biochemistry, there are some times where we have chemistry issues in our body that are not equating the right way, and we need some balance. And sometimes the only help from that can be to get this chemical situation right. So I want you to know I definitely support both the counseling and the chemistry. In fact, I spent 6 months very recently going through a very intense counseling protocol. It was very helpful, and I also found that the last 3 months of that, I also started a prescription medication known as Zoloft, and that, accompanied with the counseling, really made a difference in my emotional health. And I know that because I have evidence from my wife, who is the person who knows me the best, and has said, your emotional health has improved. And we believe that it has to do with these two things. Now, if those two don't work, it's true that for some people out there, you may need to check in, like an admission to an inpatient facility. And that's where we look at the last level here is to say, okay, what's really going on? And we spend some time. Maybe that's 1 month, maybe that's 6 months, maybe longer. But what we know is it's generally very beneficial, especially if the person who is checked in follows the protocol and does what they're told to do. And that's a very beneficial thing. So we're going to look now at some major sources of stress. And I bet you're going to appreciate these and know these very well. But the first thing that we're going to tell you is your environment is one of your major sources of stress. And I don't mean like the environment of the globe Earth. I mean like your environment that you're sitting in right now. Like maybe it's your dorm room. Maybe it's just not a good environment to be in. Maybe it's your home. Maybe you're in an abusive relationship, and we'll talk about relationships, but that very environment that you're in constantly, let me just tell you, it's going to be the silent hand that guides your behavior. And so you're going to respond differently. And I know, and I'm going to tell you, some of my own environments here in just a little bit about where I know I have a trigger and I stay away from. What we also know is that goals can be a very big burnout, and so we told you that we don't really like goals. We like systems, right? And so we want to put our focus on our systems and let the goals come. But if we rank our goals way too high, that can be a stressful thing. Another thing is you can get burnout. I mean, we just saw the Great Resignation where people left where they were working and they're changing jobs. And I see that certainly in the higher education system. But what we know is that people do experience burnout because they do the same thing for a very long time and they don't know how to deal with the stress of it. Another thing that we're going to tell you about is when you deal with change. Like for instance, when you move, it's a big deal. In fact, I told my wife I'm never going to move again. If she wants to move, then what she's going to have to do is pay someone to come and actually physically move the stuff. I'm just going to drive my car to the next house. But I also know that change is very hard, and I don't think I do well with change, and I don't think you do well with change. You know, and so if you're out there and you say, no, I really do good with change, I like that a lot, then I want you to send me an email and tell me what it is that you do and what you find attractive about change, because I really need to know that. But what we also know is if you have conflict, think about your family, think about your friends, other relationships where things have gone south, and you have to think about, in those instances, do you feel complete peace? No, you probably don't. You probably feel quite a bit of stress. And then I will end this thinking about performance. And I want to consider performance from a global perspective, not just like athletic performance or academic performance. I just want you to think about performance of your whole self. And so if you're performing well, like what are your metrics that you're even using to determine that these things are going well, right? And when you see that, what you're going to know is that you're probably stressed. It's probably going to be diminished in certain areas. And so you kind of have to back off and say, what is it that I'm going to do? And what are my systems to get me there? I hope that you've kind of taken some of this in. It's been a fast talk. In the next video, we'll look at some other aspects of stress, specifically what's happening in America and what the physiology of stress looks like. We'll see you then.